Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to another World War II lecture for U.S. History 3. We're looking at shifting the balance of power in the Allies' favor today. Let's see the tide turn. Essentially, in 1941 and 1942, things were tough for the Allies, America, Britain, Australia. They were still getting organized. In the Pacific, the Americans and the Australians were just trying to hold off the Japanese and stall until more energy and resources could be focused on the sprawling Pacific front. Here is the terms list, by the way, in case you need it. It may vary from the assignment you're given. But let's start with the Pacific front, looking at the Pacific. The major incident that we have at first is the Battle of Guadalcanal in 42 and through 43. Essentially, U.S. troops were sent on the offensive. The first Pacific offensive, and this was to some obscure corner of the world, Guadalcanal, or at least to many Americans reading about the story, seeing the video clips. That's what we were talking about. But we're talking about kind of in the Solomon Islands area, and Guadalcanal is kind of in the center of that island chain. This island, however, was very significant. In fact, these Solomon Islands were very important because the U.S. connected to Australia through these. The Coral Sea is just right over here, so taking back the Solomon Islands would have really prevented the Japanese from staging invasions, and it would ensure that the Australians and the Americans could easily communicate and exchange troops and supplies more easily. Now, officially, this is called Operation Watchtower. However, the Marines commonly refer to this mess of an operation as Operation Shoestring. This amphibious invasion was slapped together very quickly, and the island was very easily seized, in fact, by the U.S. because the Japanese never imagined that the United States would launch an offensive in 42, much less at Guadalcanal. And so they easily took the island with minimal resistance. The problem was the Japanese troops were more concentrated up north, and they would launch counterattacks. The Japanese counterattacks were quite brutal. If Coral Sea and Midway were fights of the future with the aircraft carriers and airplanes, Guadalcanal was a drawn-out bar fight with close-quarter naval ships firing at point blank, and on the island of Guadalcanal, crack veteran Japanese troops clashed with fresh American Marines in the steamy jungles. Japanese bombers dominated the skies in an attempt to knock out Guadalcanal's Henderson airfield, the reason why the island was chosen in the first place. Fortunately for the Americans, the Marines were vastly underestimated because the Japanese had widely assumed that Americans and Australians were weak, but the Allies dug in. And the Allies in this battle discovered that the Japanese are unflinching in their devotion to victory and no surrender. Both sides learned that Guadalcanal was going to be a long and hellish slog through a tiny island on the high seas in the world's largest ocean. There's some pictures of the beachfront after the battle, after one of the battles. Some damage to a ship. Now let's go to the European theater. There's a bit more going on there, because remember, the Allies decided the Europe First strategy. With Britain and America in Europe, knocking out the Italians was proving to be tougher than initially expected. Now, in Europe, with the slow progress in Italy, really early on the Soviets were instrumental. Essentially, with the epic fail of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazis were now in direct conflict with a very angry and very vengeful Soviet Russia. In fact, the Soviets will refer to World War II as their Great Patriotic War. The Nazis presented an existential threat to the Soviets. Nazi propaganda, concentration camps were filled with communists, and various barbarous acts were committed on the Eastern Front by the German invasion. And they made it clear that there could only exist one of these countries in the world. And if Moscow fell, the Soviet Party would be butchered, and it would be the end of the Communist Revolution. In addition to the Germans, they didn't see these people as anything more than people in the way of their Lebensraum. And so the Soviets were very determined, and the Soviets suffered horrifying casualties, the highest casualties of World War II. Propaganda is going to mask the exact numbers until 1961. The official count was 7 million declared, according to Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union at the time. A more realistic, non-propaganda corrupted claim actually puts the casualty count over 20 million. Experts today are more comfortable estimating about 27 million civilians and Soviet soldiers died in the war. Often under-equipped and initially poorly trained, the Russian army struggled tremendously with the Nazis. Granted, part of this was due to the fact that many competent Russian military were executed during the Great Purge or had fled the country with the rise of the communists. But anyways, what the Soviets lacked in equipment, training, skill, and, well, they didn't have the element of surprise. Everyone knew they were coming. They made up for it in numbers. Soviet troops fought hard, and they forced the Germans to devote tons of resources and troops just to hold back the communists of the Kremlin. Stalin and the Soviets, they vowed to march on Berlin, and they would fulfill that promise. Now, this tie-up of resources really helped the British and the Americans. It meant that the Africa Corps had less resources and less troops to drive the British and Americans out of North Africa. After Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was recalled, General von Arnim of the Africa Corps would actually be driven into a corner, and the Africa Corps would surrender in May of 1943 in Tunisia. Most of the Africa Corps troops would spend the war as POWs in places like Mississippi and Texas, just thus denying the Nazis very well-trained, very experienced troops for the remainder of the war. But the picture up here is the invasion of Sicily. With the help of Sicilian mobsters with inside information, lots of Higgins boats, and urban house-to-house fighting, the Allies invaded Sicily, and the Italians would crumple and surrender on September 3rd, 1943. This doesn't mean there was an end to the fighting in Italy, because what happens is Nazi troops would dig in northern Italy, in the mountains. Troops like the 442nd, the Japanese Americans, or to name one of the units, they would batter away at the Germans in places like Tuscany for much of the war. But Mussolini was down and out, and that means we've got one Axis power down, Italy, 2 to go. Now, Allied leaders, Joseph Stalin of the USSR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, often called FDR, of the United States, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill met November 1943 in Tehran, Iran. The Soviets declared that there needed to be a second front. If the Allies could hammer away at the Nazi-controlled continent, ideally in a place like France, the Allies could win, and it would take a lot of pressure off of the Soviets, who were really struggling to maintain the sprawling battle lines of the Eastern Front. And the United States knew it was going to be hard, because fighting your way up through to Germany, through the Alps that split Italy and Germany apart, is a nightmare, fighting up and over mountains. And the Nazis could easily maintain, with minimal resources, they could hold the south for the southern Alps for years if need be. Stalin and FDR agreed that France would probably be an excellent place to take a crack at the Nazi fortress, continent Europa. And if successful, British troops could liberate France, take out the Rhineland and Alsace-Lorraine industrial regions, and then smash through the plains of Western Europe all the way to Berlin. Now, Churchill was against this. He recalled the trench warfare that was fought in the exact same place in places like Belgium during World War I on the Western Front. Stalin and FDR, however, were able to persuade Churchill and the British to agree that invading Nazi Europe through France was necessary and had to be done soon. That being said, planning the invasion of France would take some time. But if I had more time to talk about it, I'd go into detail, but this is kind of a survey. I want to make sure that you get the big picture. And if you're ever interested, you can dive into the details more on your own time. But, you know, it's a survey course. We only have so much time. Here are the basics, though. To invade the Third Reich, the Allies had to trick the Germans. D-Day, which is the invasion at Normandy, as it's become to be remembered, is one of the best-kept secrets of World War II. Through spies, misdirection, outright lies, fake troop movements, all sorts of trickery, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Allied commander of the invasion, tricked the Nazis into thinking the Americans and the British would be invading the port city of Calais. I had to look that up. I took French in college, never quite picked it up as well as I would have liked. I only did a semester. Anyways, but the city of Calais, which is in this area. Well, wait, no. Calais is up here. Sorry. Calais is up here. The Allies actually invaded down here at Normandy. Calais is the closest point between the British Isles, the cliffs of Dover, and the European continent with France. And so the Nazis were conditioned to expect an attack from Calais from the sea, but instead we attacked via Normandy. But first, before this attack could begin, the United States and the British needed to take out the industrial centers throughout Europe, and they started a very aggressive bombing campaign. Essentially, what this bombing campaign would be different. Unlike the Luftwaffe's Blitz in the Battle of Britain, where they were bombing London, the Allies used longer-range strategic bombers. Partially due to fuel limitations, the Nazis had to hold France in order to launch serious bombing runs against England. And they hadn't been able to do that as effectively thanks to the increased Allied aircraft and the Soviets tying down a lot of resources. And actually, that's part of why the Nazis invested a lot of resources into backing up Italy and Vichy France in North Africa. It's why they tried to, part of Operation Barbarossa was to secure oil fields and oil supplies so that the Nazi war machine could continue on. But with the failures of both of those, the Nazis were running low on fuel. The Allies did not have this problem. No, the Americans and the British had long-range bombers that could launch from Britain and hit targets all the way in Germany. Further, American and British bombers were built to take beatings. Legendary stories of the durability of British and American bomber craft remind German citizens of the power that was behind that the Allies brought to bear with the sound of each air raid alarm. Now, we'll go into a bit more detail in one of the activities, but the British practiced the idea of night bombing with something called saturation bombing. You'll hear about this again, but it's also called carpet bombing. Instead of accuracy, essentially the British bombers, they would fly in at night and operate basically like a dump truck filling in a hole. If you dump enough bombs in the general direction of the area that you're trying to target, something is bound to get leveled. This tactic was much safer as a lack of night vision anti-air guns had a much harder time hitting the British bombers as they ran their runs. The Americans took a more daytime tactic of pinpoint bombing. Americans were kind of crazy, especially if you look at the casualties early on with the air command, when the Nazis still had decent air defense and fuel for aircraft. Precision bombing was something that had to be done in broad daylight. The U.S. used early analog targeting computers, and if the bombers weren't gunned down by anti-aircraft guns or shot down by anti-interceptor fighters, the precision bombing would allow the Allies to take out key targets with less bombs. There's more analysis on that with other historians, but basically between daytime precision bombing and nighttime saturation/carpet bombing, it meant that German industrial centers were often getting hammered around the clock. And it's kind of really hard to make stuff when everything's exploding or on fire. And so that was kind of the big impact of the combined bombing techniques. Here's some imagery of that. I believe Dresden, for example, was 95% destroyed by the end of the war,
And when I was studying abroad there, they were still rebuilding portions of Dresden as the funding opened up. That was the 2010s, I believe, when I heard about that, early 2000s. But no, so anyways, looking back, France and D-Day. The Allies decided to invade the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. It was a brutal, hard land invasion, amphibious invasion, but with the successes there, the Allies now had a claw in the supposedly invincible fortress of continent of Europe that the Nazis had been building. And in the next lecture, we're going to be ending this all-too-quick survey of World War II. The activities we'll do in this class will go into more detail over some of the different things. In any case, I guess until later.